Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Heart of America. I'm here with Alvin Dawkins again, who's going to be co-hosting this show with me on voting rights. And in fact, one of the reasons I wanted Alvin to come onto the show with me as a sort of co-host is because he's been very concerned about voting rights. And we wanted to address this from the context of knowing that a lot of people don't track history super closely. And if you're not a Black person, for example, and also maybe not a woman, you might not be thinking about voting rights in the same way and understand the history of why voting rights, even today, when a lot of people feel like, well, what's the big deal? Everybody can vote. What's the problem? We have a problem. We have a problem. And so we're going to try to express what that problem is and why there's so much concern about southern states and states. I think it's like 18 different states across the United States, if not more, have been trying to enact laws that would, they're claiming it's about election integrity, but people who have suffered from voter suppression tactics in the past are going to see this quite differently. So Alvin is here. How are you doing, Alvin?
I'm good, Amy. Thank you. How are you today?
I'm good. As you know,
Yeah.
I've just been running around. My daughter tested positive for COVID yesterday,
Oh,
but I think she's okay. She has a few minor symptoms, but she's going to get another test today. She's been vaccinated, so I'm not too worried about this getting more complicated. I know that
very
it
good.
can get complicated even if you're vaccinated, but mostly if you have other conditions as
Right.
well.
But
Yeah,
good for her that she's vaccinated because chances are she'll
yeah,
get through this.
yeah.
Yeah.
So Alvin, you grew up in the Deep South, and you watched, I mean, gosh, I think in your lifetime, you have seen the schools become segregated or
Or
desegregated in the
desegregated.
South.
Hmm.
Um, and you have seen the civil rights movement as a child, I imagine, in the South, and you grew up in the Black churches. So one of the things that we were talking about, and both of us, both Alvin and I, just want to say as a preamble to this show, that there's a lot to look at. I mean, we were looking at everything from the history of the Southern strategy to the Atwater speech about Southern strategy, to all the different voting suppression / integrity laws being passed and looked at in the United States. And there are a lot right now, as well as looking at the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, as well as the For the People Act, which was originally actually passed in Congress in 2018 when the Democrats took back the House, but has yet to pass the Senate. And then when we go to the Senate with all of these bills, we have to look at, the filibuster.
Yeah.
So it's a lot. So we've done some research. We're not perfect. And if you have any corrections for us, put them down in comments below. And we're also, yeah. And we're also going to, Alvin has provided a bunch of research links that we're going to include in the description below, and you can do your own research there. Okay, so but Alvin, I think one of my main concerns is just the history of, really the Republican Party, and there's some confusion right now around the Republican Party because Donald Trump kept trying to refer back to Lincoln, whom a lot of people see as sort of a champion of civil rights and
Hmm.
civil liberties for Black people. I mean, of course, we understand that he made a lot of comments that were not necessarily all about equality for Black people in the United States.
Not so much. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, but the history is confusing for people, and it's because somehow Republicans like to claim the high ground around race and racism, even though they are predominantly representing. In fact, I looked at some studies that showed they're representing white people much more so than the Democratic side. And we also understand that Black people voted against Donald Trump and for Joe Biden in the 90s, in the 90th percentile.
Sure.
in the last election. And so unless you think that these people are voting against their interests or something like this, then, come on, right? So anyway, tell me what you see as the history of the Southern strategy, and I can play the Lee Atwater recording as well, which
Yeah, because I think particularly the Lee Atwater recording kind of shed some light on what's been the modus operandi of the Republican Party, particularly when they're trying to uh, gain votes in the South. But I think it's important that we, kind of lay some groundwork and establish some foundation about the history of the voting rights. But to answer your question quickly, the Southern strategy basically is how the Republican Party has devised tactics in order to win the white vote, particularly in Southern states, the white male vote, and especially the white female vote, because it includes both race as well as gender and sex, as well as things where we started hearing in the late 70s and early 80s, things like family values, because all of this was designed to appeal, say, for instance, to white women who might not have, more moderate Southern white women who might not have gotten on board with some of the more overt racist type rhetoric, but would have misgivings about what they saw as a threat or an affront with the women's rights movement and feminism and abortion rights later in the 70s and things like that. So that the Southern strategy was a way, because they saw it as a three-legged stool. It was both race, it was gender, white women, and it's race, gender, and family values. Because there's something about the history of the South that it's about protecting the fragility of white womanhood, if you will.
Yeah, well, I don't feel so fragile sometimes, but gee whiz. So my understanding too is that there was a flip where we had the Dixie Democrats who were sort of representing a racist body of white people in the South. And I'm not going to say that every white person in the South is racist. That's not what we're trying to say here, right? But then there was a flip, and that was the Southern strategy, was how to bring people in the South into the Republican Party. And that, I believe, started around Nixon's time and Goldwater's time. Is that correct?
Yes, Goldwater, LBJ, and then Nixon, because you're right in that the South was pretty solidly Democratic through much of the 60s and up until uh, late 60s going into the 70s.
Yeah, this is where people
Southern
get
states.
confused. Yeah.
Yeah, this is where a lot of people get confused and either don't know or don't remember. But yeah, the South was solidly Democratic up until the tables really started to turn, Amy, when LBJ passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Because he said that he would probably, in doing so, he would probably be losing the South for at least a generation. And that's exactly what happened. A lot of white politicians switched their party affiliation pretty much immediately.
So that would have been 1965.
Right. This would have been 64 and 65. 64, the Civil Rights Act, and 65, the Voting Rights Act. Whites just in droves started changing their party affiliation to Republicans. So part of the Southern strategy then was, because the South had been so heavily Democratic. Now, these were Dixiecrats. They were called Dixiecrats, and many of them were racist Democrats. That's another distinction that people sometimes lose. So part of the strategy then was how to appeal to working class and poor white people to become Republicans.
Right.
Because much of the platform of the National Republican Party just didn't, the rhetoric didn't bode too well when played in the South. Lower taxes, lower corporate taxes, capital gains. This wasn't where most white working class people in the South live.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go ahead and play the Lee Atwater recording. I've got it pulled up here. This is actually from The Nation, magazine and also online magazine. And it's called Lee Atwater's infamous 1981 interview on the Southern Strategy. They actually somehow pulled out and found the 42-minute recording. This has been a very controversial recording because, of course, the Republicans have tried to disavow this whole thing and kind of explain it away. So I recommend people read the whole article. It's a very complex analysis of this recording. And I'm going to read, when I play the recording, I'm going to go ahead and read the introduction so that there's context. And this is actually in 1981.
Not so long ago at all.
Not so long ago at all. Okay, so here we go. And so he's talking about how the Republicans can win the South without being overtly racist, because this is 1981. So here we go. I mean, I think here we go. Here we go. The video is playing. In 1981, the legendary brutal campaign consultant Lee Atwater was working in Ronald Reagan's White House when he was interviewed by Alexander Lemis. In this audio made public for the first time ever, Atwater lays out how Republicans can win the vote of racists.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician, like political science, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all don't quote me now. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger, that hurts your backfire, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you get so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than white. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want to, is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
Okay, so so we just heard that. Your comments on that, Alvin?
1981, people. 1981.
Yeah, we're gonna have to put subtitles on that. I think, I don't know if everyone could hear that clearly, but he basically was saying in 1954 you could, this is what he said, but you know, you can't say that now. So and you could say forced busing, but that too people can see as racist. So let's actually go to other things like states' rights and it's
Lower taxes.
Lower taxes. So that's interesting to me because I never knew that all of this was actually code for sort of appealing to people who feel racist. Now, I also want to say that I don't think, and this is one of the issues that I think is more nuanced in our society, that a lot of white people in the South would out and out say, I'm a racist. I don't think that's how people think. For the most part, there are people who do think that way, and it's clear, and they join white supremacist groups and they join the Nazi party in the US or whatever, the Proud Boys or whoever. But it's something that's more, it's more like cultural, it's more embedded, or it's more, tell me, because you're from the South, so tell me about that. What is it, you know? What is it? And you'll win the Nobel Prize if you can explain it, you know.
If I can explain it, there better be a Nobel Prize at the end of this.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. How to answer that? Yeah, certainly every white person in the South not only wouldn't identify as racist, but I would say isn't racist. It's just that a lot of the policies or the talking points, if you will, is designed to appeal to a certain demographic.
Yeah.
Okay. So, for instance, Ronald Reagan in 1980 came to Neshoba County, Mississippi, to give a campaign stop. Neshoba County is just 7 miles from Philadelphia, Mississippi, where those 3 civil rights workers, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, had been murdered in '64. So not much time had passed, and the memory of that is certainly still very vivid and present for most people in Mississippi and all over the South, for sure. So Ronald Reagan comes to Neshoba County, Mississippi, to give a campaign speech at a county fair there. And among other things, in his speech, he says, "I believe in states' rights." Now, states' rights isn't just a dog whistle, it's a bullhorn, because this was exactly what Southern Dixiecrat politicians like Governor George Wallace and Governor Fulmer of Arkansas, and I'm forgetting the governor's name of Mississippi right now. But this is exactly the language that they used in the 50s, states' rights, to push against what they felt was encroachment from the federal government, wanting to come into the South to desegregate the schools and desegregate public accommodations and the lunch counters. So when Ronald Reagan comes to Mississippi in 1980 and says, "I believe in states' rights," yeah, it may not, in his thinking, been intentionally racist, but the people that were hearing it knew what he was talking about.
Right. Yeah, and that I just want to bring that to the present day, because to be quite frank, a lot of white people and probably a lot of Black people, a lot of US American people don't even have just been learning about the Tulsa massacres. I think there was another massacre maybe in North Carolina as well, where Black people were running for office, getting elected to office. And then there was a terrible violent incidents against many Black people, I believe. I think it was in Greenville and then also Axe Handle Saturday in Jacksonville,
In Florida.
in Florida, and that was a site also of a lot of Ku Klux Klan recruitment and organizing. And so Donald Trump, in the tradition of, I guess, Ronald Reagan, when he was campaigning for the 2020 election, went to Tulsa, and we all remember that, to do one of his first campaign rallies, and he went on Juneteenth. Which is the day, and a lot of white Americans don't know this either, which is the day that Black people in Texas discovered, or found out finally that slavery was over. That took like 2 years to get.
Some two plus years later.
Yeah. So that's the celebration of the quote unquote end of slavery, Juneteenth, and we know that slavery continued in the form of mass incarceration. Because that's what's in the 13th Amendment, that you can actually still have slavery as long as people are incarcerated. And that's what happened in the South with the Black codes and throwing Black people in jail so that they would continue to be slaves. So I'm just pointing that out. So we had Donald Trump, and I'm going to say something as an Asian American in Tulsa. And this was, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but it's something that sticks in my craw, because Kellyanne Conway, who is a woman that I have very little respect for at this point, was asked by a reporter at one point if Donald Trump and the White House were using the term Kung flu somewhere at the beginning of the coronavirus in 2020. And she was so indignant. And she was so self-righteous and saying, "Of course we don't. How awful that you would even insinuate such a thing." All of this. And then at the Tulsa rally, Trump leads the whole crowd in, "Let's all say this together, the Kung flu." And he does that like 2 or 3 times. So now everybody knows. I mean, so anyway, I'm just, it's the ignorance of the racism that does exist that is more a problem to me than the racism itself, like the ignorance of the racism and the dog whistling that's happening. So anyway, I hope that this show will help everyone to understand things within the context of reality and real history. So let's go to, actually I have these handy dandy cards. We have talked about the Southern strategy and Lee Atwater. And now we're going to go to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, because this is the issue that we're dealing with, that the Voting Rights Act has, people have this idea, Alvin, that we are making progress all the time, right? So we passed the Voting Rights Act, right? That became law. And now we're all good and we don't have to worry anymore. But the truth is that
Everything is hunky-dory, right?
Right. So people don't think we're as racist as we are. So talk about the erosion of the Voting Rights Act and why these states can now create laws that remind us of the voter suppression tactics of the South.
Well, that's certainly part of the reasoning of the Supreme Court in the Shelby County versus Holder, and I believe it's 2013 that struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And part of their reasoning is that we're no longer living in the same conditions that warranted the key features of the Voting Rights Act of 65. But backing up a little bit, even the 1965 Voting Rights Act was an enforcement mechanism. It was designed to enforce what had been written in the 14th and 15th Amendment of the Constitution. Back in the 1800s. So the 1965 Voting Rights Act was supposed to be the enforcement mechanism that, the rights of citizenship and equal protection under the law and voting had been granted to the freed slaves, to Black people in the United States as citizens of this country.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here with the actual reading of the 14th Amendment. Actually, this is the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The Congress, that's Section 1. Section 2, the Congress shall have no power to enforce this article. The Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. This gives Congress the power to enforce the voting rights by enacting federal legislation that ensures racial equality in voting. That is in the Constitution. And then it talks about how the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870 had little impact for almost a century because states imposed poll taxes, literacy tests, and other restrictions that kept African Americans from voting. But the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has done much to guarantee voting rights for African Americans and other citizens of color. Okay, so just to people, this is a great little book. It's the whole Constitution in a little pocket size.
Little pocket size.
Yeah.
Carry it with you.
Yeah.
Like I believe Stephen Breyer does.
I don't know who that is. Who's that?
He's one of the Supreme Court justices.
Oh, he is? Oh my goodness, that's great. I to not know. What's his name again?
Stephen Breyer.
Okay.
One of the ones they're trying to convince to retire so that we don't have another Ginsburg situation.
Okay. Right. Okay.
But anyway, just to clarify, Amy, the Voting Rights Act of 65, although it was especially concentrated to Southern states because of, the discriminatory practices that had been happening in the South historically, but it applied all over the country because Black people were having issues voting in other states. So it was happening in Michigan and, other states as well. It was a high concentration of practices of discriminatory practices in the South, literacy tests, poll taxes. I mean, out and out violence, night riders and the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council and all of this kind of stuff, because it was downright dangerous. And I remember some of this. It was downright dangerous to go down to your county registrar to attempt to register to vote. I mean, it could cost you getting beat up. It could cost you losing your job. And that was some of the least of it. You could have a cross burning in your yard, kind of thing, or your windows, your house bombed, or, these kinds of things. So the 1965,
you could be killed if you were a student coming down to try to help.
Yes. Yeah. And a number of them certainly were. Yeah.
Were killed. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Voting Rights Act of 65 was the enforcement mechanism for what had been ratified in 1870, but wasn't enforced by Congress. So fast forward to today, some people can think erroneously that, why are we still talking about or dealing with these things. Haven't we settled this? Well, no, not at all. If anything, these things are being rolled back, like the Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, which gutted um, key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5, that
Mhm.
was the pre-clearance part. Yep, pre-clearance. Actually, it was Section 4 that they gutted, which made Section 5 unenforceable because, yeah, it made Section 5 unenforceable. So, and then more recently, the Arizona decision here last April, Bronovich versus the DNC, which gutted provisions of Section 2. All right.
What is section 2? But now let's go back and talk about pre-clearance, because pre-clearance, I'm just going to summarize and then you step in. And my understanding is that because southern states, and not just southern states, maybe other states too, but any state that had a history of discrimination based on race or skin color in terms of voting rights was subject to pre-clearance around any voting legislation, changes to how people can vote, where people can vote, when people can vote. If they had a history of this kind of voter suppression, they had to take their legislation to the Justice Department, to the Civil Rights Division, to be pre-cleared for whatever legislation that they wanted to enact. And this is the part that now no longer exists because of the Supreme Court. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So before any state could pass any law around voting, they had to get the clearance first from the Justice Department. They had to go before the DOJ.
Right.
Yeah, they no longer have to do that now. And what happened immediately after Section 5 was gutted?
Yeah.
Immediately, you started seeing states start to put in these voter suppression, voter ID laws, cutting down on the number of days that you could vote,
Right.
or early voting, or
Right.
Sunday voting,
Right.
souls to polls, that kind of thing. That all of these had the effect of affecting Black and other minority communities that tend to vote Democratic.
Right. And because a lot of Black people go to church on Sundays in the South, and then they would all go and vote on a Sunday after church. What was the phrase you used for that?
Souls to polls, souls to the polls.
Souls to the polls. I love that.
Mhm.
Okay, but then what did this decision do? This is 2021, and I had not known about this. So can you talk about this one? Do you
Yes,
know
I'm
much
going to
about
have to
this one?
look at my notes on that, the Section 2. Give me just a second.
Okay, well, but my point, I'm just going to share a little bit in terms of my analysis of all this, is that clearly racism is not over. And you could argue, well, there's a sort of a blurring of the lines between out and out racism and total partisanship around trying to keep people from voting. Why would we try to keep people from voting? We don't have enough people voting in this country. We should be mandating voting as they do in some nations. I believe in Australia, voting is like mandated. You have to vote. And so that means you have to pay attention to the issues, you have to get involved. And I'm not saying that we need to mandate voting. I'm not sure what we need to do, but more voting is more democracy,
Well, I certainly agree that we should make voting easier,
Yeah.
not harder.
Yeah.
And you have to ask the question, why in a democratic, quote unquote, society
Right.
are there efforts at making voting more difficult, especially when we have some of the most secure voting systems throughout the country. I mean,
Yeah.
the instance of quote unquote voter fraud is just it's negligible.
Yeah.
Not saying it doesn't happen at all, but
Right.
it's very, very minor.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
we brought this up in our last discussion together, that the Heritage Foundation, which is a very, very conservative right-wing think tank, actually has a map of all the actual voting fraud incidents that have ever actually happened with evidence. And you can go there and check it out. If you click on one state, for example, you'll find, maybe you'll get 10, maybe one instance of voter fraud that's actually been recorded and verified as a real incident of voter fraud. So we don't have a voter fraud issue in this country. We have I mean, every now and then here and there, perhaps. We also have states like Washington State, I believe in Oregon, where mail-in voting has been happening for years, And because, during the pandemic, mail-in voting made a whole lot of sense. So everyone made, we didn't want low turnout. We wanted high turnout. It was a very important election. A lot of states started enacting just automatic mail-in voting, and of course the Republicans got freaked out about that because generally speaking, the more people vote, the more Democrats win.
That's very true.
Yeah.
And Democrats tend to vote early, and they tend to vote by mail. Republicans tend to vote day of,
right,
and tend to go to the polls. Now in Florida, a lot of Republicans do vote by mail, including Donald Trump. Donald Trump voted by mail.
I know.
Go figure.
I think Pence did as well. Yeah, I know. It's just crazy. It's just a lot of propaganda. It's very upsetting when you think about it. But anyway, whatever. I mean, to be honest, I think a lot of Republicans are like, at this point, what I'm seeing is like, this is not all Republicans, but a lot of them are like, you know what, if we can't be Democratic, we won't be. We just have to win. And I think actually a lot of people who are racist, who are concerned about the non-whiteness of this country now, because I believe it's in 2045 or something, whites will be a minority in this country. And that's really scary for people who are afraid of people who don't look like them, who are afraid of possible retribution, who are afraid of whatever they're thinking about, which I don't think any of it's true. I think they're actually moving toward, maybe we don't have to be a democracy. I fear that that's actually a line of thinking that is not spoken, but is happening. I mean, certainly it's happening inside our political, all of the politicians who are now trying to downplay January 6th, who are supporting Donald Trump's lie about election fraud.
And that are aligning themselves with, the really radical paramilitary elements, like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, that are not denouncing or putting down those elements, but they're actually aligning with them. Yeah, I think you're right that there appears to be a kind of scorched earth kind of thinking that, if rather than to allow this country to be taken over by the Democrats, by the radicals, by the liberals, by the blacks, browns, gays, fill in the blank, we'd rather let the house burn down. We'd rather align ourselves with communist, nationalist, autocratic despots, which is really, really weird, because I can remember being a kid in elementary school here, and we'd have those civil defense drills in the 60s where, you had to get down and put your head under the desk because this was a drill in case there was a nuclear attack by Russia.
Who now a lot of actual Republicans are like, well, maybe that system's not so bad. The autocracy.
Maybe it ain't so bad.
It is not democratic in Russia. There's no free press in Russia. This country is run by Vladimir Putin.
Well, they're killing journalists in Russia.
And they're killing journalists in Russia. Some journalists have committed suicide in Russia also, just because it is so horrific to be a journalist there. So to me, that means that they're willing to take this document, the Constitution, and throw it under the bus. So anyway, okay, don't get me started. Maybe what we should do, Alvin, is have we should have a video recording, a show of just talking about the liberal position on things, so they're not so scary. What do liberals really think? And we could say far left people think this way, but across the liberal spectrum, this is what we think about abortion. This is what we think, and this is why, so that, because what's happening is there's a dehumanization and demonization of the left happening.
Yeah.
And people will say, oh, but you've been so mean to Trump supporters. Look, Trump supporters are the ones coming out with AK-47s. Okay. It's not the same. It's a false equivalency. Liberal people are not wanting to go out and shoot at people or anything like that. And we're kind of aghast at how people are showing up with guns and weapons at our politicians' homes, at our health officials' homes, for Pete's sake. Like, there's some kind of rhetoric that's just so inflammatory. I mean, we know what the rhetoric is, we've seen it, but to demonize Democrats and to make them, even to the point of saying that they're devil worshiping pedophiles, for Pete's sake.
Yeah, yeah.
This is not a good path. It is a very bad path. And genocidal experts have said, this is the path to genocide. This is what happens, this kind of rhetoric about one part of your country. So anyway, I'm sorry. I said, don't get me started, but I did.
You did, and that's okay. And liberals aren't necessarily gun-hating people. Liberals own guns too. They just don't own an arsenal necessarily.
Right.
Necessarily, and they're not predicting that there's going to be an apocalypse, that the world's going to that this is Armageddon.
Well, the climate. We would maybe talk about the climate apocalypse, but people I know aren't arming up. They're trying to organize their communities to be resilient and to try to have compassion for each other. Anyway, go ahead. Okay, no, go ahead. It's important. Go ahead.
Here's what I think I see, and my perspective, particularly living here in the South and having grown up in the South, is that I'm in the heart of Trump country, for sure. I mean, Alabama is so solidly red, it's not even funny.
Right.
But I'll tell you something. When I used to take my mom to Walmart, I would meet and talk to people that I'm sure I know they were Trump supporters. I'd see their MAGA hats and the stickers and stuff on their cars and their trucks and stuff. But at the same time, these were some of the same people that were friendly. They were helpful. They would see me with my elderly mom. My mom's in her 90s, and they'd ask, do you need any help? Can I get this for you? Same people. So I know that they coexist, and that everybody that voted for Trump isn't a racist, and I would never want to put them in that category.
Well, but it's not even explicit racism. It can be just a feeling of like, white people are superior. That could just be a background, subconscious. And it doesn't mean that I'm not going to be nice to Black people. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to even support equal rights at some level. But I think that, to me, there's a background sort of subconscious thought system happening.
Sure. And
we don't want to lose our place,
There's a lot of history to back that up as well, because with that, there is a sense, and it's mostly probably unconscious, of a sense of entitlement.
Yes.
That because I'm white, I'm entitled to certain rights or certain privileges simply because I'm white, because I've had it all my life. My parents have had it. My grandparents had it.
Right.
And but I mean, this goes all the way back to conversations I recall having in the 70s and the 80s around affirmative action, that many white people saw affirmative action as an affront to them, because they felt that they were losing something. They were giving up something. They're losing ground to all these Black and brown people coming in, taking our jobs, or women.
People say privilege. People have a hard time letting go of their privileges, and maybe that's natural. But I think what is the wake up position? I mean, how do we wake people up? Well, for me, it's like, well, okay, look, it's okay to let go, because you losing maybe a chance at a job opportunity. First of all, from a spiritual perspective, you don't lose it really any chances, right? You'll get where you belong if you believe in yourself. This is something that conservatives say all the time. So if you just work hard at it, and if you believe, and if you think positive, all these good things. So there's that. Go ahead.
I just think that there's a coming together if we're going to survive as a democratic republic.
That's right.
If we're going to survive, there's going to have to be a coming together.
That's right.
Around issues of race, gender, sexual orientation, all of this. And that part of that conversation has to be, rather than seeing the pie as being further and further divided, therefore it means that if this other group is getting some of the pie, I'm not getting a piece of the pie. Why don't we just make a larger pie?
Right, exactly.
There's a larger pie, because the resources are basically unlimited.
Right.
The resources are unlimited.
Yeah,
Now,
especially if we start
it-
taxing these people who aren't paying any taxes.
for instance,
That's another interview I just did with Michael Mechanic, who wrote Jackpot, which is going to be our next show here. But
but
yeah,
that kind of thing, Amy, serves the purpose that if you have the very, very ultra wealthy, the 1%ers paying
yeah,
very little to no taxes,
yeah,
and that part of that money, part of that uh, financing finances the division at the lower realms that keeps black and brown and white people fighting amongst ourselves
that's right.
overcomes, and that we see each other as enemy rather
That's right.
than attacking, going at systemic injustices. I'm not
That's
talking
right.
about going against individuals or against people, talking
Yeah.
about going against systems of injustice,
That's right. That's right. And also I call it taking care of each other.
taking care
The
of
way
each
that
other.
so many of these Nordic countries do in Europe, they just free education, free childcare, just you are supported to live your best life. That's what we all want. And I will tell you, I have seen figures on the infrastructure package that's moving through. We're trying to get through the Senate right now with a lot of difficulty, and the reconciliation package. There is huge support for these packages from Democrats and Republicans. It's like 66% for Republicans. So
That's right.
this is how much we are like the Republican Party leadership is completely out of step with what people really want. They want health care, they want coverage for pre-existing conditions, they want support for their families, just like we all do. And then we will see a healthier society. I'm not saying we have to subsidize everybody like we already do with the fossil fuel industry to the tune of like $11 million a day or something. These are executives who are getting wealthy that we subsidize. And we're not complaining about that, but we complain about the single mom, who's just trying to get food on the table for her kids and pay the rent. We don't want her to get any subsidies from the view of the GOP, right? And that's been a racist. In fact,
Yeah.
welfare moms was a way that Ronald Reagan played that race card too.
Well,
And
this,
we're going to run out of time soon, so I'm not sure. Do you want me to go over the all the different voter suppression laws? Because I'd like to get to that, and also the acts that are relevant. But what do you think?
well, how much time do we have? About 5 minutes or so?
Yeah,
Or?
5 minutes too.
I don't know if that'll be enough time to get that in. I'd like to kind of want to leave this on a higher note, if you will, that all of that is, at least in my seeing, it's all changeable. Because yeah, if the Republican Party, you mentioned the 66% of Republicans are wanting the features in this legislation.
Yeah.
But the Republican Congress and the Republican senators aren't listening to their own constituents. Why is that? It's because they're serving the moneyed interest.
Right.
And they can do that because they're coming from mostly highly gerrymandered districts that they don't have to listen to their constituents.
Right.
Because they're going to win regardless.
Right. And some of these new acts coming in that are on the table would actually restrict gerrymandering. We've got 5 minutes. Let me go through just our notes so that we can just sort of say we covered all this and we can revisit it, but it's going to be old news pretty soon. When I last checked, there were 30 laws in 18 states, either enacted or in the process of being enacted. They included, and these are what we would call voter suppression or anti-democratic laws: shortened window to apply for a mail ballot. Why? Shortened deadline to deliver a mail ballot. Why? Make it harder to remain on absentee voting lists. Eliminate or limit sending mail ballot applications to voters who do not specifically request them. Why? I mean, again, restrict assistance in returning a voter's mail ballot, limit the number, location, or availability of mail ballot drop boxes. Why? Impose
like one in all of Harris County, Texas.
Right. And particularly Harris County, has been an issue because Harris County includes, is it Houston, I believe?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So because that's where you're going to have a lot of Democrats. Expand voter purges or risk faulty voter purges. Increase barriers for voters with disabilities. Ban snacks and waters to voters waiting in line. Limit early voting days or hours. Eliminate election day registration. So the bills that are coming in would actually cover the bills that are in Congress would disallow a lot of these changes and revert back to more full access to voting.
Yeah, it would
And
restore a lot of the features of sections 2 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act.
right, that's right. And so we have HR 1, which is the For the People Act. And actually, the support for that is 67% of national likely voters support HR 1, including 56% of Republicans, 68% of independents, and 77% of Democrats. And I think, and then we also have, I mean, it's 800 pages, we can't get into everything, but there's also some campaign finance reform elements, which we all can agree we need to bring more transparency to, major lobbyists and corporations and how they donate into dark money funds and so forth, beefing up ethics laws for members of Congress, and on and on. There's a lot here. Everyone should take a look at it. There are a lot of articles about it. And then there's the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and it would modernize the Voting Rights Act formula, determining which states and localities have a pattern of discrimination. That goes back to the pre-clearance issue. I know I'm covering a lot, you guys. We have a lot of links we're going to provide in the description here. And then there was an op-ed on September 14th by Jennifer Rubin in the Washington Post. And this is about this new, you were saying that Joe Manchin, and I've been reading about this too, has sort of renegotiated, I believe, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to make it something that he would vote for. But then we're dealing with the filibuster. That's a whole nother issue.
That's right.
Yeah, and the filibuster is actually not in the Constitution. It's not something that we need to have. It's been actually already reformed around Supreme Court justices, cabinet appointees. Could have been filibustered, but no longer. So, since we don't have a lot of time, it just seems so important to, and let's come back and revisit these issues in another segment. But just if you could sort of summarize how you feel about what needs to happen in Congress right now, because people can call their representatives, find out who they are, call them. There's been a lot of pressure on Manchin. People went to his yacht and protested. Right. And I think that's great. Protest actually historically makes a difference in how people vote. And that's why people protest.
Yeah, we need to put some pressure on Senator Manchin and as well as Senator Sinema out of Arizona. Yeah, that there needs to be some carve out or some movement on modifying, if not getting rid of altogether of the filibuster. Without sounding hyperbolic at all, this is down to the wire. This is crucial. We are right at the cliff of potentially losing this democracy, this representative republic. It may still look like it, you know, that we'll still have elections and, send representatives to Washington and things like that. But if states can prevent whole swaths of people from voting, or if not that, those people vote, but their votes can be nullified. Their votes can just be canceled.
And that's one of the scariest things, is that a lot of this,
because that's what's happening in these states as well.
Yes, tell us about that, because people need to understand it's not just restricting access to the ballots, it's also changing the nature of who gets to make decisions about whether elections are free and fair at the state level. Go ahead.
Well, it's a full court press is what's happening. It's suppression on the one end. It's purging people from voter rolls altogether. That's happening on one end of the spectrum. And on the other is that if you do show up and happen to vote, your vote may not count. It just may not count because the people that they've installed or put in place, partisan representatives, if they don't like the outcome of an election in Georgia or Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, wherever, they can just nullify it, wipe them clean, and send their own representatives or electors.
That's insane. Imagine the chaos. Imagine how much chaos. Here's what I want to try to share with people. We are dealing with a virus, okay? Whether you think it came out of a lab or out of a bat, okay? We are dealing with a virus. We are dealing with climate change, okay, and the catastrophes that will happen from climate change, which I hope everyone understands is happening. And we need to be united in order to deal with these issues. We need to have a strong functioning democracy and government. It's looking very teeter-tottery right now, what's happening with our government and with these attacks on democracy. So the only thing I can think of to say is we need to engage. We need to engage to vote. We need to engage to get out the vote. We need to engage to reform the filibuster. In fact, if we have to do that to pass these laws, as far as I'm concerned, that's what we have to do.
And you know what else we got to do, Amy?
Yeah.
We
Lots of things.
But
Lots
besides,
of things.
besides get out of here because we're crunched for time. We're probably over. We've got to have conversations with each other.
Yes.
We have to get out of our conditioned silos.
Yes.
We got to reach out to people that don't look like us, that don't vote like us, that don't worship like us. We have to do this deliberately.
Yeah.
And start having conversations and just listening.
Yeah.
Listening.
Yeah. Actually, People's Action does that. They call people and they actually listen. That's their number one tactic or methodology. I just interviewed Justine Lee. She's the executive director of Living Room Conversations on my radio show. I hope to have her on this program soon as well. And she makes those dialogues happen across the country, but we need to pick up the pace. Like the rate at which it's happening is not fast enough, big enough.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you where I find some hope. If you watch Borat 2, I forget what the actual
I haven't
title.
seen it.
Okay, well, this guy pretends to be a lot of different things.
I've seen the first one. Yeah.
Okay, so in this second one, he goes in and he ends up, because it's coronavirus time while they're filming, he ends up quarantining with two full-on MAGA Trump supporters and conspiracy theorists in some southern state. And he's running around with no clothes on, saying all kinds of outrageous things. And here's the thing, these guys are super sweet to him. Like they're putting him up for free. They're letting him live in their house. And then they're on the computer telling him about how Hillary Clinton is running a sex trafficking ring, right?
Wow.
And so after this, actually on Netflix, there's a whole program about how these guys, they went back and revisited these two guys who, it's just like you say, when we actually meet face to face, we recognize our humanity. We all care about this country. We all actually believe in fairness. I think most of us, and some of us are maybe way far out in the sociopathic realms, but most of us believe in some kind of equality. We all want respect. We all want the same things. We want.
I tend to think that's true for the overwhelming majority of us. Yeah.
So Netflix has a series, I think it's Netflix, where they go back and they take every conspiracy theory these guys believe in, and they educate them about the science around coronavirus, around Hillary Clinton. And there's this really cool episode where they're listening to the experts, quote unquote, right? And all of a sudden Hillary Clinton herself gets on the Zoom meeting with them.
Oh boy.
to tell them how much it hurts her feelings, how attacked, she says it really hurts my feelings. And they're like, but their minds change. Maybe because they're treated with respect, they're actually given access to, and people's minds do change when they can take in information without feeling attacked, I believe.
Yeah, I completely agree. People's minds change, and when they feel listened to, when they feel heard, when they feel seen.
Right. So anyway, well, on that note, that's a good note to end on. We'll try. We know we covered everything super quickly. But we will put some resources into the program description. And if you have comments, if we made any mistakes, please go ahead and share those thoughts with us too. Thank you so much, Alvin.
Thank you, Amy. This has been fun. This is great.
Yeah.
Everybody go to the links and do the research, reach out to your representatives, engage in your communities and talk to people.
If you don't use your democracy, you lose your democracy.
Amen to that.
Yeah, we'll catch you on the flip side.
On the flip side.